Welcome to Aquarius 2020, the latest in my Bootcamp for Saints video series, where I work through each section of the Gospel of Mark as it tracks the signs of the zodiac. Now, like in our previous Sagittarius video, this section points explicitly to Aquarius. Now, Aquarius is also the only sign that's represented by a man. You've probably heard the song, "When the moon is in the seventh house, and Jupiter aligns with Mars, and peace will guide the planets, and love will steer the stars." This is the dawning of the Age of Aquarius. Yeah, this is life. Everything has a dark side, including Aquarius. Aquarius is associated with democracy and the free exchange of information. And while there's an argument over when it starts, some believe that it already has. The internet, for example, is explicitly Aquarian. Without government and corporate intervention and funding, it would never have happened. Without individual participation, we wouldn't have any use for it. But Aquarius is also associated with revolution and the violent overthrow of structures. Thus, it should not be a surprise that the Aquarius section predicts the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. That launched the age of Pisces. That's the church age, the age that we're just emerging from, or already have, depending on who you talk to. I believe this section predicts that Jesus will return in the age of Aquarius, God willing, in my lifetime. I believe this is also the age when we homosexuals emerge fully accepted in the Christian community, without the help of the anti-Christian troublemakers who've been using us as a battering ram against the faith for the past 50 years. Unfortunately, the Christian leadership has left itself vulnerable to these attacks because they've been lying about the Bible for centuries and using it to slander and libel us. I'm going to finish this video with an epilogue. I'm going to revisit the so-called secret mark, which I talk about in the Scorpio section because it's in the Scorpio section. It's better known as the longer Gospel of Mark, LGM for short. There's been a breakthrough, and like every breakthrough that I've had so far, it just confirms my case that after Jesus married Lazarus, after Jesus resurrected Lazarus from the dead, he married him. Now, here Lazarus is known only as the rich young man. In fact, there's a very interesting parallel to the Gospel of John that also strengthens my case that I didn't notice until just a couple of weeks ago. I was going to leave this out and post it as a separate video, but it's so crucial in establishing my credibility as an interpreter of Mark that I decided I better keep it in, especially since my interpretation is so strange. Now, because it naturally is its own video, I'm going to split this off into a separate video. In this video, I'm also going to talk a lot about the Jewish historian Josephus. I've talked about him previously. I believe he was a Christian. I'm more confirmed of that now than I was in the past. And I'm surprised to discover that I'm not the only one who thinks that or thought that. I'm convinced that whatever sources Mark used to talk about the fall of Jerusalem here, Josephus was using the same source. He also uses sources from the Gospel of Luke, used by the Gospel of Luke as well, as you'll see. I don't think he read Luke. I'm pretty sure he did not read the Gospel of John. In fact, I'd be surprised if he did. Maybe an early draft of it, but not later. But I'd also be surprised if he had not read Matthew and Mark, especially if he's a Christian. Matthew is the Jewish Gospel. Matthew, Mark, and Josephus all lived in Rome. And if you were in the Roman Church, you knew Matthew and Mark. And since I'm confident now that Mark was inspired to organize his gospel along the lines of the zodiac by the cult of Mithras, and the cult of Mithras was probably created by the Roman government to unify the personalities of Roman soldiers so that they learn how to face death well. And since Josephus had been adopted into the emperor's family, hence Flavius Josephus, there are too many important connections to ignore, especially since many important members of the Flavian imperial family converted to Christianity. So they had to hear about it from someone that they trusted, and Josephus seems like an obvious choice. This section will also be split off into a separate video because it's important and a separate thing in its own right. Okay, so let's begin our journey into the Bible. Starting with the sun's journey through the night sky. Here, of course, is Aquarius himself. His deacons are Pisces Astrinus, the southern fish, not to be confused with Pisces itself, which is the next and final sign. There's also the beautiful and well-loved Pegasus. And finally, we have Cygnus, a beautiful swan. As far as I can tell, none of these deacons make an appearance here. Now let's see what Aquarius is about and how it might relate to this section of Mark's Gospel. This is from the Gospel in the Zodiac by the Reverend Bill Darlison, practically the textbook for this series. In the last chapter, we noted how Saturn symbolized structure and order, and how this was in keeping with its rulership of Capricorn. But Saturn is also the planet of decay and death, and there is a certain appropriateness in its ruling two signs together. Like Janus, it seems to face both ways. In Capricorn, it represents the building up of structures. In Aquarius, it represents their dissolution. In modern astrology, this aspect of Aquarius has been appropriated by Uranus, the planet of violent disruption and radical change, whose existence was unknown to the ancient world, but whose principle seems to have been associated with Aquarius from the earliest times. Together, Saturn and Uranus are said to rule Aquarius, the one signifying gradual erosion, and the other sudden and unexpected destruction. In Greek myths, Saturn is a child of Uranus, but he eventually eats his own children and castrates his father. Now, there are times you can see Uranus with the naked eye, and lots of people did, and even wrote about it. But everyone seems to have thought it was just a faint star. No one seems to have figured out it was a planet. So it doesn't have any impact on astrology, I don't think. Reverend Darlison talks about that in a footnote here. Saturn ate his own children and castrated his own father, Uranus. And yes, that does show up in our Aquarius section. And now let us continue with our reading. After we skip a few lines, the tension between structure and anarchy which Aquarius symbolizes can be detected in the work of Aquarian writers, who often seem to be breaking the stylistic conventions. James Joyce, born 2nd February 1882, is an obvious example, but Joyce's literary iconoclasm was anticipated by fellow Aquarian Lewis Carroll, 27 January 1832, who invented the anarchic wonderland. It's very difficult to get more revolutionary than James Joyce. Now, with all this talk of revolution and the violent throwing down of structure, the status quo, this talk of the end of the church age, the age of Pisces, combined with the increasingly blatant hostility towards Christianity that we see on the part of the global elites, who in turn have embedded a self-perpetuating ideology of anti-Christian hatred throughout our society. Criticism is fine. This beast is a totally different animal. It has been embedded so deeply and so comprehensively and so obviously self-perpetuating that it seems impossible to root out and burn away. Combined with the increasing number of people gaining access to opportunities either to convert or refuse to convert, so that there's less and less of an opportunity, if you want to call it that, of plausible deniability before the judgment seat. This is why I think the end of times is coming soon. Again, hopefully in my lifetime, God willing. If we aren't closing in on the fullness of the Gentiles now, then I don't know if such a thing could ever happen. Also, with the internet, we have an explosion of knowledge, right? We just talked about that. Daniel, chapter 12, verse 4, tells us that that's going to happen right before the end. It uses the word da'ath. Now, my New Revised Standard Bible translation translate that as evil, but it's knowledge everywhere else. I don't know why it wouldn't be here. I would not be able to do my research for my videos without the internet. I mean, this stuff can be used for good or can be used for evil. Well, all things are good. They come from God. It's the devil that perverts it. I wouldn't be able to use this increase in knowledge for my research, not at the rate that I'm doing. No way. Okay, now with all that in mind, let us read our Bible. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." And Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." The old system is so utterly annihilated, there's no evidence it ever existed. Looks like we've passed up Mr. Joyce in the Department of Revolution. It can't happen soon enough as far as I'm concerned. When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. And you will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs. As for yourselves, beware, for they will hand you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings because of me as a testimony to them. and the good news must first be proclaimed to all nations. This is one of the reasons why I think we're approaching the end. This is the age of the internet, at least, if not the age of Aquarius. There's nowhere to run from the gospel anymore. When they bring you to trial and hand you over, do not worry beforehand about what you are to say, but say whatever is given you at that time, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. There's Saturn and Uranus, and then Zeus and Saturn. You will be hated by all because of my name. We're going to talk about this, but let's finish. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. I even wonder about this, to be honest. So I finally started reading Flavius Josephus, and to do that, I bought an old copy, very old, of a translation from the 1700s by a man named William Whiston. Now, if you have a founding father who didn't read Greek and or couldn't get access to the original Greek of Josephus, this is a translation they would have read. It would have been considered the most up-to-date. And a lot of them could do both. Now, the life of Flavius Josephus, which is his biography, is among the last things that he ever wrote. And it confirms both my theories that the infancy narrative of the Gospel of Luke is a Jewish priestly source. It comes from the priests. And that Josephus was actually believed that Jesus was the Messiah, which he said he did in the Antiquities of the Jews in his so-called Testimonium Flavianum, which he'd written before he wrote his life. Everybody accuses us of coming up with this or tampering with it, but if you just assume that he believed Jesus was the Messiah, although he had doubts about his divinity, everything in his biography and in his writings will make perfect sense. Talk about all this in my video on Libra, which is linked below. Long story short, he pulled that testimony from the same source Luke used to write his story about the incident on the road to Emmaus. So if he were a Christian, why didn't he just say it? Well, the New Testament actually tells us high-ranking Jews, elite Jews, high-status Jews like him, and he was the cream of the crop, kept secret if they converted. If I'm right about Josephus, and that secrecy obviously continued more than 20 years after the destruction of the temple, and that is confirmed by the fact that about 20 years after he died, every Jew who confessed Jesus was Lord was expelled from every synagogue. They were completely expelled from the religion. Let's look at the many, many parallels between the life of Josephus and the Gospels, Luke especially. Like with the Testimonium Flavianum, they demonstrate to me that Josephus isn't as much quoting from the Gospels as he's pulling from the same sources that they did. Okay? And a close scholarly reading of his complete works, obviously in the original Greek, will help tease out a lot of these details. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Jewish Christians would be so heavy into biographies and histories at the same time we have a Jewish historian of the caliber of Josephus. This almost choreographed explosion of biography and history is unparalleled among either the pagans or the Jews. And I think it's because the evangelists and Josephus were all Christians. Now our parallels. Josephus starts with a genealogy. His is not as extensive as Jesus's. He is the descendant of the Hasmonean priest kings who ruled Jerusalem before the Romans took over through his mother. So his status is about the same as my theoretical Eliezer ben Boethus, who I think is Jesus' husband. That's Lazarus' real name. Josephus, and that's paragraph 1. Josephus was a child prodigy like Jesus when it comes to the Bible. This obviously supports my position that a priest was the source of Luke's infancy narrative. It's something Josephus would know about because this is part of the narrative of the infancy narrative. Here Josephus specifically compares himself to Jesus. But if you pay attention to the detail, he's favorable to Jesus. Josephus comes from a family of highborn priests and was born and raised in Jerusalem. Jesus is from a lower class family. I wouldn't say impoverished, but maybe lower middle class, working class, in northern Galilee. And as far as the locals were concerned in Jerusalem, especially high-ranking people like Josephus and his family, they were semi-barbarians. And Josephus was about at least a year older than Jesus. Now remember when you were that age, there's a big explosive growth in boys, in their brains and in their bodies, 12, 13, 14 years old. Remember what a kid a year older looked like compared to you at the time. It was a big change. Now, also, Jesus wasn't even 13 years old yet. And by Jewish tradition, it wasn't until you were 13 that you became responsible for following the commandments. You weren't considered a man. Also, it's actually not correct to say that Jesus was a prodigy. It's It's more correct to say that he was just naturally wise and discerning. While Josephus was more technical smart than even most of the adults in his life, certainly more than anybody his age, but that's not at all uncommon for high IQ children going into a family calling like being a priest or being a lawyer. You know, you're hearing that from your father your whole life, trained about it your whole life. Josephus's gifts assume a brute intellectual force combined with training. Jesus's, the presence of a flexible and robust native intellect. That's a lot broader than simple brute IQ. So once again, Jesus comes out ahead. Paragraph 2. Also paragraph 2, Josephus studied under a man named Banus, who sounds a lot like John the Baptist. In fact, you'll see Josephus probably quotes from John the Baptist, a quote that is recorded, or at least alludes to a quote that comes only in the Gospel of Luke, only Luke. Paragraph 3, he's in a shipwreck voyaging to Rome, just like Paul of Tarsus. 11, a man named Varus slays messengers of Philip so he can retain power at Philip's expense. Kind of like the vineyards, workers at the vineyard think they can kill the vineyard's owner, the son of the vineyard's owner, and own the field. Paragraph 12, Jesus, son of Cepheus, is from a lower class family, probably something like Jesus's, burns down a palace meant to be destroyed by Josephus and steals the furniture. Very expensive furniture. Very expensive furniture. The palace had pagan idolatrous carvings on it or something, so Josephus had to destroy it. This is in contrast to Jesus of Nazareth. He picks up his sword. We also see that the priests become quite wealthy through tithes. John of Gischala does not render under Caesar the corn that belongs to Caesar, paragraph 13, but instead takes it for itself. He also makes a nice profit on an oil deal using religion as an excuse. Oil as in oil lamps and stuff, not, Texas tea. Josephus, who is now Caesar, has legitimate claims to this. He is the Caesar. He's secular authority in Galilee. Josephus is a peacemaker, paragraph 14, avoids bloodshed without actually disarming troublemakers. Sends out 70, like Jesus, to judge, gives them authority. Story that once again only shows up in Luke. In Josephus's case, these men are hostages that he befriended. You're being held hostage, you're kind of the enemy. They liked him so much. They were willing, they could be trusted to go out. Here's a famous quote. It's a fantastic quote, actually, from paragraph 15. I was now about the 30th year of my age, in which time of life it is a hard thing for anyone to escape the calumnies of the envious, which Jesus did not escape, although he restrains himself from fulfilling any unlawful desire, especially where a person is in great authority, Jesus. Yet did I preserve every woman free from injuries, and as to what presents were offered me, I despised them as not standing in need of them, nor indeed would I take those tithes which are due to me as a priest from those that brought them. He behaves like Jesus at the exact same age Jesus was when he started his ministry, which we only find in Luke. Josephus the peacemaker, proving that he can be trusted with authorities in Jerusalem, paragraph 15. 23, as Caesar, Josephus only demands due loyalty and due diligence. Thus, men from Trachonitis are not required to convert. It's not Caesar's place. Josephus is an excellent commander, something that's nice to know. Paragraph 24. Paragraph 28. This guy's a Christian, come on. The retinue of the wife of Ptolemy, the king's procurator, pillaged. Josephus declares, it is prohibited by our laws to spoil even our enemies. Okay, This guy, Whiston, has a footnote. How Josephus could say that the Jewish laws forbade them to spoil even their enemies, while yet a little before his time our Savior had mentioned it as then a current maxim with them, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thy enemy, is worth our inquiry. I take it that Josephus, having been now for many years an Ebionite Christian, that is a Jewish Christian, had learned this interpretation of the law of Moses from Christ, whom he owned for the true Messiah. For it follows in the succeeding verses, which, though he might not read in St. Matthew's Gospel, yet he might have read much the same expression in his own Ebionite or Nazarene Gospel itself. I think he did read Matthew's Gospel. Don't you love the phrasing? This is from the 1700s. Of which improvements made by Josephus after he became a Christian, we have already had several examples in this life, and shall have many more before its conclusion, as well as have them elsewhere in all of his later writings. Okay? Well, there's not much that's later than this. It's one of his last things that he wrote. Again, something render under Caesar. Paragraph 31, Josephus doesn't want to force conversion. That's not a thing of Caesar. The men they want to convert are accused of witchcraft. Paragraph 35, Josephus shows mercy to his enemies and, like Jesus, gives them bad news. There's no way they're going to beat the Romans. Now, when you tell people that things are okay when they're not okay, you're not their friend. That's enabling. And someone who enables you is not your friend either. You got to have some backbone. It means, obviously, there are times you can't talk to people about things, like the kids when they're acting up, but try to, don't pretend like nothing's wrong. Paragraph 38 through 39, they turn against Josephus. No mention of it being because he was a Christian. I think that's because even 20 years after the destruction of the temple, when he's writing this, he still can't be pushing this too hard. He probably got a lot of pushback, probably got in a lot of trouble for confessing Jesus as the Messiah in his Antiquities. Paragraph 41, the Jews of Galilee loved Josephus, just like they love Jesus. You cannot say that the Jews murdered Jesus. The leaders did, certainly, and they're in hell for that. Well, actually, they might have repented. But no, not the Jews in general. Also, paragraph 41, speaking of that, high-status Jews stand with Josephus just as many of them stood with Jesus, although secretly for the latter, maybe even for both. Acts 6:7 specifically mentions priests. Probably Josephus' father, I think. Josephus has a certain person in a dream telling him that he has a long and happy life ahead of him. I get the impression that you're supposed to know who this person is. I bet it's Jesus. Perhaps Josephus is the one who endures to the end. This is all paragraph 43, I think. When I heard of this is an interesting quote. The entreaties of the Galileans, and saw what sorrow the people were in, I was moved with compassion to them, and thought it become me to undergo the most manifest hazards for the sake of so great a multitude. It sounds like Jesus. He's exhausted, he's ready to go, but he looks up and he sees that they're sheep without a shepherd, and so he stays. Mark is very clear about that, Mark 6:34. Paragraph 44, they pretend to be honorable and friendly, but they have laid their bait and their knives are ready to go. Just like with Jesus, are we to pay taxes with Caesar or not? We're just curious, What's your answer, Jesus? The delegation from Jerusalem tries to find witnesses willing to lie about Josephus. They don't really care if it's true or not. They just want what they want people to say things about him. Another interesting quote. I advised them to fight with nobody, nor spoil the country, but to pitch their tents in the plain and be content with the sustenance they had brought with them. For I told them that I had a mind to compose the troubles without shedding any blood. This is, I would say, clearly alluding to a quote from John the Baptist that is only in the Gospel of Luke. Wicked piety used to conceal treachery. Oh, they're so good at that. Like a gorgeous mausoleum holding putrid corpses. Josephus confirmed in his government mercy to a conquered enemy who was wicked and treacherous. Love thy enemies. Punishes one of his own soldiers who had taken some plunder to use him as an example for all other soldiers who'd done likewise. Paragraph 60 through 64. Many others wrote histories of the Jewish war with the Romans, but Josephus wants to set the record straight. He also writes this to a man named Epaphroditus as if he's carrying on a conversation with him. both just like in Luke and Acts, written by Luke. And now I'm going to read the very first word from Josephus's Jewish Wars. Words of Jesus in this Aquarius section that we just looked at should come to mind. I'm confident he was telegraphing to his fellow Christians. He was thinking of Jesus when he wrote this, just like he was thinking of Luke's John the Baptist in paragraph 47 with that quote. Whereas the war which the Jews made with the Romans hath been the greatest of all those, and not only that have been in our times, but in a manner of those that ever were heard of. Okay? For in those days there will be suffering, such as not been from the beginning of the creation of God, that God created until now, no, and never will be. Both of those wherein cities have fought against cities, or nations against nations. Come on, guys. When you hear, now the first is from Mark 13:19, this is Mark 13:7-8. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed, but this must take place. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. This is all cutting things way too close. There's no way this is an accident. Sorry. Now let's look at Mark 13:14-27. It has many interesting parallels in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew. When you see the one desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one on the housetop must not go down or enter the house to take anything away. The Greek ha used here is masculine. Men slept on the rooftops, in beds obviously, so it's better translated as a man on the housetop. Luke will make some very interesting expansions here. The one in the field must not turn back to get a coat. Woe to those who are pregnant, to those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not be in winter. For in those days there will be suffering such as not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now, no, and ever will be. And if the Lord God had not cut short those days, no one would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he has cut short those days. And if anyone says to you at that time, look, here is the Messiah, or look, there he is, do not believe it. False messiahs and false prophets will appear and produce signs and omens, and lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be alert. I have already told you everything. But in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds. Aquarius is a water bearer, so are clouds, with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds and from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Luke is going to make some very interesting changes to Mark's eschatology, especially in regards to the work of these angels and that man in his bed. So we'll start with Luke. The part in green is the so-called Q source, a collection of Jesus' sayings that both Luke and Matthew pulled from. When you look at their end-time discussions, it seems like they're repeating things. That's why. They're knitting together two sources, Mark and Q. I call this the gay rapture. And by the way, this is not the end time section of Luke's gospel. That's where he pulled in everything else we just read in Mark. That's chapter 21. This is chapter 17. So although Matthew puts this saying in his end time section, as you will see, Luke treats it as a separate work, although obviously it is dealing with the end times. Then he said to the disciples, the days are coming where you will long to see the days of the Son of Man, and you will not see it. They will say to you, look there, or look here. Do not go. Do not set off in pursuit. For as the lightning flashes and lights up the sky from one side to the other, so will the Son of Man be in his day. But first he must endure much suffering and be rejected by this generation. Just as it was in the days of Noah, so too it will be in the days of the Son of Man. They were eating and drinking and marrying and being given into marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed all of them. Likewise, just as it was in the days of Lot, they were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But on the day that Lot left Sodom, it rained fire and sulfur from heaven and destroyed all of them. It will be like that on that day that the Son of Man is revealed. On that day, everyone in the housetop who has belongings in the house must not come down to take them away. And likewise, anyone in the field must not turn back. Here he is, churning through Mark's version. Remember Lot's wife. Those who try to keep their life will lose it, but those who lose their life will keep it. I tell you, on that night there will be two in one bed. One will be taken and the other left. There will be two women grinding meal together. One will be taken and the other left. Then they asked him, "Where, Lord?" He said to them, "Where the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." So now we have an expansion on the man in his bed, and now there's another man in it, although, as I said, he did carry through with Mark. As for the women, the word meal is not there. That's assumed. And they're not together. They're not just together. They're in the same, meaning in the same place. Okay? What place is that? Well, in bed. They're grinding in bed. They're having sex. Now, if you want to deny the homosexual elements here, separately, you can do that. But put these elements side by side and there's no room for plausible deniability. Men slept together on the roof. That's what they did. Women grind meal together all the time. Nothing to see here. Don't you wish? I'm not done yet. Now, at the end, Jesus does not say, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. He says, wherever the body is, the eagles will gather. That is what Matthew means, and translators get confused about this. But the key to translating Luke's treatment of this particular cue source is he's talking about homosexuals and a rapture. Everything falls in line from there. Luke uses the Greek soma for the body. That's a living body. Matthew uses the Greek ptoma. That is a corpse. And you'll see the exact same play of words in the Pisces sections of Mark in the next video. Joseph of Arimathea will ask for Jesus' soma. Pontius Pilate will give him his ptoma. These people knew what they were saying, and details matter. You're going to see another example of details and how they matter. They both use the Greek aitoi for the bird. The word left on its own is eagle, and that's what you assume if it's left on its own. But in Latin, at least, this could go either way. In fact, as I told you, you need to translate it as vulture in Matthew, even though it's the same word. The King James translates both as eagles. On the other hand, the New Revised Standard Version here translate both as vultures. As I said, experts get confused about this. So you have lightning and eagles and missing living bodies. Thus, the narrative is framed by elements of the story of Zeus and Ganymede. Now, the audience for the Gospel of Luke was non-Jewish Greeks. They would have known exactly what Luke was getting at. Ganymede was a beautiful prince whom Zeus had captured to bring to heaven as his cupbearer, and presumably lover. Thus, we're out of room for plausible deniability. If we were before, we certainly are now. So notice he's talking about Noah and marriage, and giving into marriage, and Sodom and Gomorrah. Jesus is linking here in his gay rapture the exact thing Jude does in his epistle. He's linking together Genesis 6 and the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. In 6, the sons of God had married the daughters of men and polluted the human bloodline. This directly led to the great flood. And as for the messengers, angels, who did not uphold their own office, but deserted their own places. I like the way Dr. Nyland translates this. Deserted their places like a soldier would abandon his post. He has held them firmly in eternal ropes, down in the gloom, waiting for the judgment of the great day. Just like these, Sodom and Gomorrah, as well as the surrounding cities, which in a similar way committed porneia. I like the fact that she did not translate that, too complicated to go in here. Which in a similar way committed porneia and went after different flesh, strange flesh, alien flesh, serve as an example of those who undergo punishment in the eternal fire. A lot of people want to translate this as unnatural, therefore implying homosexual. No. Strange because they're angels. So now you have even more bad news. The paired men and women are linked with paired pairs of unlawful divine human unions. That's exactly what we're getting at here. That's what they have in common. That's why he says, just like these. Even worse, even though you have two homosexuals and two lesbians in same-sex relationships, active same-sex relationships, it has no bearing on whether or not they go to heaven. The New Testament makes it 100% clear that the sin of Sodom had nothing to do with homosexuality. The Bible talks about it a couple of dozen times, never says that it does. What the sons of God and the Sodomites have in common is only one thing. They violated boundaries. In this case, the boundary of boundaries, the boundary between heaven and earth. All other boundaries are founded on it. If that goes, it's like jerking the rug out from underneath them and chaos reigns. This is why both violations demanded divine intervention, one with water, the other with fire. I'm not going through Matthew's version because comparing these three parallel gospel accounts of the end times is way beyond the scope of this video. You can pause this video if you'd like, if you want to read these passages or just look them up. As you can see, Matthew carries forward Mark's narrative. Notice the repeat. Watch out for false messiahs. He's knitting together two sources. Once again, Luke does bring in Mark's narrative, but mostly in chapter 21. Here is where the New Revised Standard Version gets it right. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Luke is talking about the rapture, while Matthew is talking about the persecution of Christians that will come before it, and in fact is happening right now and will certainly get worse. There's Mark's rapture, it's here, but it's not in Luke's version because he moved it and expanded on it. And you will also notice there's Noah, but there's no Sodom and Gomorrah in Matthew's account. As I said in several of my videos, here, Matthew actively runs away from anything that looks even remotely gay. You're going to see an example of that in our last Aquarian passage here in Mark. You will also notice there are two in a field. And once again, they've mistranslated this passage here. Matthew doesn't tell us these women will be grinding mill together. He tells us these women will be grinding at the mill. Just like Luke, he's telling us where. He's just moved the where. You don't have to trust me. You can easily look all of this up online. That's what I do. Once again, run away, gay. And once again, if you're trying to deny the homosexual elements of Luke, you've got nowhere to run. Now we may ask, who changed this story, Luke or Matthew? Matthew did. How do I know? Well, Luke's narrative is coherent. Matthew's is fractured. It's broken up. Now, Luke could have constructed the story out of Jesus' sayings, but one other thing tells me he didn't. This linking together of Sodom and Gomorrah with the sons of God in Genesis 6. That's a Jewish thing. Not Greek, but Jewish. From that period, Second Temple period. Jude did it, as you see. It also shows up in the so-called Testament of Naphtali in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Remember, Luke was a Greek writing for Greeks. And later non-Jewish Christians were baffled by this connection. They completely missed it. So they missed the homosexual elements. Although some of them did catch on to this, there's evidence that they're monkeying around with the text. Even worse, they would take other passages, like the Jude passage, flip them and use them to attack homosexuals. Really nasty work. Next quote. I put these sections in green because this is Mark's famous sandwich technique. He uses one story to frame another, and they both dialectically interact with each other. So it's story A and story B. Story B is inserted between A, and so you have an A1 and an A2. Okay? The broader point he's making with this particular sandwich is that everything the Sanhedrin did to Jesus, they did it only because God allowed it. In fact, he insisted on it because Jesus' sacrifice was the only thing that could save us. In that light, notice that these evil men cannot even pick the timing of their actions. God forces them to act on his timetable. He's in complete control now and still is. They want to do this later, but they will do this now. It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him, for they said, not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people. While he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. Notice we're not naming her. I believe Mark was written when the temple was still standing, and the temple authorities were still firmly in charge. I further believe these temple authorities did not want Lazarus named because that was too humiliating. And to ensure that didn't happen, or people figured out who he was, the evangelist couldn't even name anyone in his family. They were too famous. The Gospel of John, chapter 12, verse 3, informs us that this is Lazarus' sister Mary. It was written more than 20 years after the temple was destroyed. But some were there who said to one another in anger, Why was the ointment wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii, that's more than a year's wages, and the money given to the poor. And they scolded her. But Jesus said, Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Here the association of Jesus with Lazarus, by way of his sister, is yoked to Jesus' resurrection and empty tomb. Our next video will be the last in this first iteration through Mark and the Zodiac. It will be for Pisces, and there Lazarus will once again be linked to Jesus' death and resurrection. Specifically, it will be linked to the clothes Jesus will be buried in, just as his sister is linked with his burial ointment, except obviously he will not be named. And thus, now let's finish our sandwich. Truly I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. When they heard it, they were greatly pleased and promised to give him money. So he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. And now, we finish with our quotes. On the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and make the preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So he sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him." The very image of Aquarius. You will note this man does not show up in Matthew, because Matthew, again, runs away from the gay, and only women carried water in this part of the world. Thus, we're looking at something of a girly man. And wherever he enters, say to the owner of the house, "The teacher asked, 'Where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there." So the disciples set out and went to the city and found everything as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal. And now we end our meditation on Aquarius. Next month is Pisces, and the end of our gospel. Before we finish this video, we're going to go back to the longer Gospel of Mark, and to do that, we must go back to Scott G. Brown's book, Mark's Other Gospel. I used to highlight my books, and I've started highlighting this one again, and making notes and everything. Yeah. And it's been 13 years since I last read this book. 13 years. Wow, how time flies. This is his translation of LGM. This is actually LGM 1. I've already treated this in previous videos, but we're going to read it again because I can now put it in a more secure context. Because there's also an LGM 2, which I hadn't talked too much about in previous videos because, to be honest, I had no idea what to do with it. But Dr. Brown has helped me out on that. First I'll read it, then I'll plug it back into Mark's Gospel. It's going to sound odd sometimes. That's because that's what the Greek is actually saying. "And they come to Bethany, and there was there a certain woman whose brother of hers had died. And coming, she prostrated before Jesus and says to him, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.' But the disciples rebuked her. And having become angry, Jesus went away with her into the garden where the tomb was. And immediately was heard from the tomb a great cry. And approaching, Jesus rolled the stone from the door of the tomb. And going in immediately where the young man was, he stretched out the hand and raised him, having grasped the hand. But the young man, having looked upon him, loved him, and began to beg him that he might be with him. Going out from the tomb, they went into the house of the young man, for he was rich. And after 6 days, Jesus gave charge to him. And when it was evening, the young man comes to him, donning a linen sheet upon his naked body. And he remained with him that night, for Jesus was teaching him the mystery of the kingdom of God. Now rising, he returned from there to the other side of the Jordan." Now we go on from there. LGM 2 is on the bottom. So right off the bat, what are we looking at? A sandwich. We have an LGM 1 and an LGM 2 because they're an A1 and an A2. Mark's sandwich technique wasn't officially recognized until the 1970s. In fact, it wasn't even thoroughly fleshed out until the 1990s, in some cases, even later. None of these scholars consulted Mark's longer gospel. It would have undermined their credibility. So, whoever wrote it knew that Mark used this technique, and as you will see, he knew about it in extreme detail. Way back in 1958 at the latest, because that's when it was discovered and documented. Obviously, the only sane explanation for this is Mark wrote it. It's a little lopsided. A thick piece of bread on top, as thick as the meat in the middle, and then a final piece of regular-sized bread on the bottom. Weird, but still workable as a sandwich. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want for you to do for us whatever we ask of you." "What is it you want me to do for you?" "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and the other at your left, in your glory." "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" "We are able." "The cup that I drink you will drink, and the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When they heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be the first among you must be slave of all. For For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. They came to Jericho, and there were there the sister of the young man whom Jesus loved, him, and his mother, and Salome. As I said, that's the actual Greek. And Jesus did not receive them. Now, details matter. LGM2 does not say they came into Jericho. It says he came into Jericho. Notice how the A1 and the A2 here are linked. And they come to Bethany, and there was there a certain woman whose brother of hers had died. He came to Jericho, and there were there the sister of the young man whom Jesus loved, him, and his mother, and Salome. Typical features of the twin stories in a Mark and sandwich are blatantly present here. First, the only character who shows up in both stories is Jesus. The disciples might be there as well, but typically they're minimized. They're basically background. As you see here, in the beginning they're an LGM, but they're quickly gotten rid of. Why? Because they're dense. They don't get it. They're stuck on the ways of the world. And we see here with them squabbling over status. We see that. Hence, the dialectical interaction with the story of the rich young man who does get it. The energy of the entire narrative complex, from all of these complexes, derives from the same source the battery does. Contradiction between poles. LGM2 also behaves like a typical A2 story in that it introduces new characters, in this case, the rich young man's mother, and Salome. Now, as I said, these traits are typical, meaning not all the sandwiches have all the traits. But I think we've reached the point where if this is a forgery from 1958, or maybe even from a couple hundred years before, maybe the document itself was forged by the people who wrote it, because I think it was like 200 years old, it's a miracle in its own right. So think about this man's mother. I get the impression that he was like a little boy. Not naive, but just really open, like children can be. Think of a 7-year-old boy. That's a really fun age. I think he was like that. He was wealthy, probably handsome, and I get the impression he was very broad-spirited, that he was gracious to everybody that he met, including those who were beneath him socially. And that's about 99% of the people that he met. So I would imagine his prospects for marriage were very good. Pick of the litter, and I'm sure his mother counted on it. I'm sure her devastation was complete. And then you have this. Whatever he had going on with Jesus. I think it was a marriage. Happy to be wrong, but from what I'm about to show you, probably not. As I said, it secures my case even stronger. Okay, now, LGM1 points back to chapter 10, where Jesus first meets the rich young man. I talked about that before, way back in the Libra section. This entire sandwich points right back to another sandwich. Way back in chapter 3. And the crowd came together again, so that they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for people were saying, he is beside himself. And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, he is possessed by Beelzebub, and by the prince of demons he casts out the demons. And he called them to him, and said to them in parables, how can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is coming to an end. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods, unless he first binds the strong man. Then indeed he may plunder his house. Truly I say to you, all sins will be forgiven the sons of men, and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. For they had said, he has an unclean spirit. And his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him. And they said to him, your mother and your brothers are outside, asking for you. And he replied, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking around on those who sat about him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. So we have the same topic of contrast here that we'll have later in chapter 11. Chapter 10, the non-crazy contrasted with the crazy. And the crazy doesn't know they're crazy. We need to talk about this passage. So what happens when you marry somebody? Their family becomes your family. Jesus is treating Lazarus' family exactly the same way he treats his own, because Lazarus' family is now Jesus' family. The Gospel of John does the exact same thing, except from the other half of the family orchard. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, woman, here is your son. Then he said to the disciple, here is your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. In fact, they even use almost the exact same terminology. In John, the disciple whom Jesus loved. in longer Mark, the young man whom Jesus loved, and his mother in Salome. Although in longer Mark it actually says the young man whom Jesus loved him, obviously a transmission error. Somebody's sister is important in both Gospels. They're doing the same thing. There is no other conclusion to be drawn. There is only denial. Mark and John, therefore, are clearly drawing from the same well, the same sources, and working through them independently. Josephus is doing the same thing. I don't think John even knew about Mark's longer gospel when he wrote his gospel decades later. Mark is also more constrained by external events, and so it has an impact on how he treats his story. For example, there are two Bethanies. There's one near Jerusalem and there's another on the other side of the Jordan. Mark moves it over there. But Mark didn't have to. But the story of the woman with the alabaster jar, we're right back to the original Bethany, where the story actually took place, near Jerusalem. Now, another thing about this passage is we Protestants assume that it diminishes the reputation of Mary, demonstrating that we're right about her and the Catholics are wrong, along with the Eastern Orthodox and everybody else. Actually, the only thing, and I have to say, as a Protestant, and I am a Protestant, I'm happy to be one, we always talk about what the Catholics believe. It's just like, we need to start talking about what the Catholics believe that everybody else believes. Now, actually, the only thing this story tells us is Jesus' mother was worried about his son, about her son. That's the only thing she's worried about. Just because friends and family members thought he might be crazy doesn't mean she did. But if everybody was talking about him like that, she would want to get him out of that situation. Finally, if you read the Protestant King James Bible or the Catholic Douay Rheims, and these are older translations, they say his friends and not his family went to grab him because they thought he might be crazy. Yet virtually all the modern translations say his friends or his family. Okay, now the Greek says hoi par autou, those belonging to him. So it can go either way. But since they do not talk about his friends at the end of the narrative, but do talk about his family, there's no reason to assume they're ever talking about anybody but his family. After all, why would they be in this story if they didn't think he was crazy? And why would he refuse to be there if he didn't like the reason why they were there? If you think I'm crazy, then you're not doing the will of God, right? And as for Mary, I agree with the Catholics. And when I work through this passage, I leverage that point. All right? This was a teachable moment, and Jesus took advantage of it. I'm sure the Mother of God was perfectly fine with that. Now I'm going to finish with some quotes. And I'm going to pop this in. It's not in the text. The mother of the king is the Gabira, the great one. You see this all the way through the Old Testament. Okay? For the southern kingdom of Judah. Every time you see a king, I think there's one exception, they always say his mother was, but not the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. The only one who's called a Gabira is Jezebel, but it's a southerner from Judah who's calling her that. I have to follow up on that, but that's what I was told by a scholar you can trust. David had his Jonathan. Who did Jesus have? He had Lazarus. He grieved over Lazarus, but he's God, so he resurrects him. The king, you always have to know who his mother is. She's the great one. Solomon sets up a throne for his mother, Bathsheba. Okay. I believe we treat Mary as the Queen of Heaven for the exact same reason I believe we treat Jesus and Lazarus as a couple. Because it follows up on the Bible. That's called a type, by the way. When somebody does something that predicts the future, it's a nonverbal prophecy. Anyway, let's get back to this. I'm going to finish with some quotes from Dr. Brown's book and comment on them, because I think they're going to show you that I'm hardcore. I don't have hidden agendas. I track the text very tightly, as much as possible for any individual. I might have my hidden biases and my assumptions, but inevitably those get caught out after decades of shifting through the text over and over and over again. You work through it over and over and over again. If I have any questions, I look to the Greek and the Hebrew. You just saw me do that. Let me put it to you like this. Diligently searching through the text is like refining uranium for a nuclear bomb, except this is far more powerful and it's eternal. Okay, page 131. Excuse me while I get to that. Okay, so talking about Clement of Alexandria, his letter has the longer Gospel of Mark in it. His Christian use of mysticon is generally different and more in keeping with the biblical association of mystery with knowledge, theological truths that are mysterious. Okay, a few partial exceptions occur in the Pedagogus, one of his works, when Clement applied the word to necessary evils, and we're going to talk about this, that is, biblically mandated practices that contravene his Gnostic ideal of freedom from emotion, apatheia, namely sex, the mystic nature of rights of nature ordained in Genesis 1:28, from a quote, okay, the holy kiss, and Esther's mystical adornment of herself with jewelry and makeup, which Clement interpreted as a symbol for the high price of her people's ransom. Actually, she's a Kadishah. The theme common to these applications of mystagon is the paradox, the mystery, that certain behaviors associated with passion are divinely mandated. So many problems with this. Clement's attitude is traditionally Christian, and that's why we're having such trouble with this passage. The body is functionally viewed, it might as well be, a parasite attached to the soul. Anything the body likes cannot possibly be good. Yet the body is infested with sin, that's true, but the body comes from God, so the body's good by its nature. Further, every part of your body has its own intelligence, even the penis. A man who's a quadriplegic can't feel anything below the neck. He can still make babies. I knew a guy who took care of a quadriplegic. It still worked. Thus, every part of your body is waiting to hear the good news. I talk about this in July of 2019, a video called How the Brain and the Body Work Together, linked below, obviously. It talks about how that works. If Jesus got baptized, if Jesus married another man, it's not because he was a sinner or not because he was gay. It's because he's trying to tell us something. So we need to get to the bottom of that. We need to follow up on that. He's pointing to something. And we go, okay, so let's follow up on that. Speaking for myself, I point out that we're not supposed to become Christians. We're supposed to become Christs. Then there's the idea of sacred twinship, which I demonstrated in videos, is clearly important to early Christians. So we're twinned with Christ. That's homo. But most importantly, we're always accused of being unnatural sex. Like is not supposed to be married to like. But there is a place in nature where like is married to like, in the heart of a sun, fusion. There we go, back to our uranium again. I point that out in my Capricorn video, which of course I link below. Now I brought that up there, the stars, in fusion, because Jesus says that after the resurrection, we won't marry or be given into marriage, but we'll be like the angels in heaven. And I pointed out that the angels and the gods for the pagans and the hosts of heaven are often compared to stars. Well, in the beginning of this video, I talked about the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 4. Let's look at the verse right before that, verse 3. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever, demonstrating that Jesus is saying exactly what I said he was saying. This isn't wish fulfillment. Only God's will be done. So the final commentary on Clement's attitude towards the human body, the two great philosophers are Plato and Aristotle. It has been said that every philosopher that comes after them comments on Plato and Aristotle. We have too much Plato in Christianity. He has his place, but we have too much of him. We need more Aristotle. And Aristotle demonstrates correctly that the body is part of the soul. That's why we insist on resurrection. People think that's crazy because they're Platonic back in the day. The Gnostics, no, because you're Platonic. Thus the feelings, which are the body's way of feeling itself around the world, okay, are also part of the soul. So let's have no more of this discussion about apatheia. Feelings are like the gestures of a blind man feeling his way around the world. You don't blow off the gestures. You don't get attached to them either. You accept them for what they are. Page 133. I really should bookmark this, sorry. This is what Clement probably meant when he referred to the Lord's mystical acts in 117. They are acts and sayings performed for the purpose of conveying a deeper meaning. Since Clement supposed that anything Jesus did or said could have a mystic meaning, it seems likely that the mystic deeds gave some indication of their symbolic orientation. Possibly some, like LGM 1 and 2, provide a series of indeterminate references or gaps for the reader to fill. Yeah. They're giving you all the pieces, put it all together, and don't deny, get out of denial. And perhaps were patently symbolic. The sayings may have included the greater use of tropes, such as hyperbole or parable. One can only speculate. Similarly, the phrase mystikon euangelion emphasizes this gospel's symbolic and theological orientation. As Marsh puts it, the adjective mystikos attached to a noun invests the latter word with the quality of a hidden treasure, which can be enjoyed only by those who are not only aware of the treasure's existence, but have the key to its discovery. I think the key here is the Gospel of Mark tracks the zodiac. If you follow up on that, you're amazing. It's amazing what you're going to pull out of the text. Page 134. Clement thought that the evangelist John endeavored to get behind the external facts, the body, recorded by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in order to disclose their inner theological significance, the spirit. But whereas the fourth gospel brought out the spiritual truth concealed within the three synoptics, Mark's more spiritual gospel brought out the allegorical significance of his first edition. So the longer gospel is to the gospel that we have of Mark is the same as John to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All right? Now, longer Mark is a more spiritual gospel like John. Thus, like John, Mark has to talk about Jesus' beloved disciple. And I've already talked about their parallels. Page 141. Although longer Mark did not contain the Gnostic tradition, it apparently had the potential to be misconstrued. Like the materials Clement omitted from Estramates. He had Estramates, he flat out says, there's stuff in here I'm not telling you. This potential made longer Mark dangerous in the hands of the uninstructed, like a dagger wielded by a child. Okay. And that's true. For a shocking amount of time in our lives, we don't believe it because we see it. We see it because we believe it. We see what we want to see. I can see how same-sex relationships can be abused, and I can see why they didn't want to talk openly about this. Like Mary, back in chapter 3, I'm not scandalized by this, although I actually am. What if I'm wrong? What if this didn't happen? But what if it did happen and I don't say anything? The text is saying what the text is saying. Page 142. Many other scholars declared the text to be self-evidently Gnostic, and some suppose that the incident has homosexual overtones. The gay reading of LGM 1b is very popular among non-scholars. Now, I think there's a combination of denial and confusion here, as there is with homosexuality in general. Scholars who think this passage is authentic, who have accepted it as authentic because it clearly is, deny its obvious gay overtones, while conservative Christians who deny its authenticity call it for what it is, gay. And Dr. Brown thinks of that line of thought as something along the lines of sexual libertinism, as opposed to a same-sex couple in a chaste relationship, which is clearly what we have going on here. And of course, we're looking once again at the confusion on how the body and the brain work together. So now we're going to look at page 154. Perhaps then we should stop trying to situate LGM2 within the world outside the text and ask how it functions within its literary context. So this is about LGM2, but it's really about the whole thing. Whatever its meaning, LGM2 has a literary function with respect to LGM1. It creates an intercalation, that is a sandwich. As we will see in chapter 6, comparison of the first sentence, LGM2 with LGM1 reveals an extensive parallelism. And of course, we've already looked at that, so I followed up on that. Now, Dr. Brown asks a series of questions. I say this is about marriage. Let's see if that assumption can answer some of his questions. This is from page 155. All right, what cries out from the tomb? Death. Without going into too much detail, there's an element of exorcism here that survived in this, not only here, but in John's version. It's death itself. I've also pointed out that this is the revisioning of the death of Enkidu and Gilgamesh. Jesus is the new Gilgamesh, and also the new David with his Jonathan. Okay, why is a loud voice heard before Jesus raises the man? Because death knows Jesus is coming. Is he not dead? Yes, he is. Again, this doesn't have anything to do with homosexuality. How does a young man wealth explain why they retire to his house? I don't know. Why does Jesus stay for a whole week? Because Jewish weddings lasted a week. They lasted 7 days. What command does he give to the young man? I don't know. What happened to Jesus' disciples? Well, it's his wedding weekend, and he's probably a little bit tired of them. Yeah, they've been very taxing, as you saw with the intercalation. the sandwich, the meat of that sandwich. What is the significance of the linen sheet covering the young man's naked body? Well, the naked body and the linen sheets, the burial cloth, as I'll talk about in the Pisces section, that's also pajamas. Okay. Why is this meeting private and nocturnal? What exactly is the setting? Are they still in the house? Did they ever leave it? What is the mystery of the kingdom of God? Why does Jesus teach it to this individual? These are all grouped together. It's private and nocturnal because it's a wedding night. Jesus teaches it to this individual because Jesus is the head of his new household. Jesus, yeah, he has a new household. Lazarus is his husband, and the head of the household is the head of the faith as well. Why does the author identify only one of the new characters by name? I'm not sure. Who is Salome? Don't know. She does show up in the Gospel of Thomas, however. You know the part with the beds, one taken, one left? She shows up with that. Makes me wonder about that. How is she related to the young man's mother and sister? Don't know. Why are there 3 women in Jericho when Jesus arrives? What do they want with him? Why does Jesus not receive them? We talked about that. Same reason why he didn't receive his parents. Okay, so he goes through all those questions. Okay, I'd say my theory tracks the text very nicely. I'm not imposing anything on this. In fact, every time there's a new question, the same answer pops up. Jesus and Lazarus got married. Now, this final quote talks about the sandwich technique of longer Mark itself. I successfully paralleled it with the sandwich back in chapter 3. He does talk about that sandwich, but he doesn't follow up on it like I did. He didn't make the connection like I did. And therefore, he certainly does not make the connection with the Gospel of John that I did. He's seeing it because he believes it. As you can see, there's nothing evil about that. If we don't have assumptions, we don't make it in the world. You just got to be aware that you have assumptions and get ready to discard them if they don't work out, if they're guiding you away from the right thing. Just keep purifying that spiritual fuel. Okay, this is from 179. I'm going to skip on up. As far as I can tell, John R. Donahue's 1973 book, Are You the Christ?, offered the first systematic exploration of the idea that there is a dialectical relationship between the inserted material and its framework, whereby the stories serve to interpret each other. In other words, someone back in the 1930s had realized that we looked at this sandwich, but they didn't really know what to make of it. He's saying that there's dialectical interaction between the bread of the sandwich and the meat. This idea is now commonplace among Markan scholars, though it was still in need of demonstration when Edwards wrote his 1989 article, partly because only a few of the 6 classic examples can clearly be shown to work this way, a point that is not generally conceded. I mean, they weren't even looking at this thing in 1958. And as of 1989, they still had massive amount of work to do on this thing. Longer Mark's editions around Mark 10, 35 to 45, reflect a comprehension of Markan compositional technique that was barely evident in the secondary literature a decade after Letter to Theodore was discovered, after this thing was discovered. It's because it's embedded in a letter. And was not widely appreciated until 2 decades later, when the Gospel scholars began to take an interest in literary theory. This strongly suggests that the letter was not created by a modern scholar. The most important books on the Gospel of Mark at the time the letter surfaced: Vincent Taylor's Commentary, 1952, and Willie Markson's pioneer effort in Markan Redaction Criticism, 1956, it was discovered in 1958, amply illustrate how ill-prepared scholars were in the 1950s to identify and decipher Mark's literary techniques. This is especially true of the manuscripts discoverer Morton Smith, whose unmarkan and strangely historicizing interpretation of LGM 1 and 2 led a half-dozen reviewers to characterize him as a 19th century rationalist. I mean, he wasn't even in the game. Like most scholars, Smith did not appreciate the figurative nature of the imagery of initiation in either the letter or the Gospel's quotations. Okay? And it carries on. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that he just didn't appreciate. So it's exactly as I've been telling you. Even the homosexual scholar who discovered LGM1 had no idea what he had on his hands. And as I said before, we either have an authentic account written by Mark himself, or we have a minor miracle. So Now we come to the final end of everything in this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it is useful to you, and I hope it is a blessing to you. God bless, and I'll see you in less than a month for Pisces. This video has been pretty late.